People often mistake volume for power. In the boardrooms of Chicago, I have watched men in $5,000 suits pound their fists on mahogany tables, their faces red, their voices echoing off the glass walls. They shout to command the room. They shout because they are terrified that if they are quiet for even a second, everyone will realize how little control they actually have. I learned a long time ago that true power doesn't need to raise its voice. True power moves in absolute, terrifying silence. My name is Helen. I am 68 years old. When I look in the mirror now, I see the silver threaded through my crown of natural hair, the deep lines around my eyes, and the quiet stillness of a woman who has survived more storms than most people have read about. 40 years ago, I didn't have glass walls or corner offices overlooking Lake Michigan. I had a tiny two-chair hair salon on the south side of Chicago. I swept up floor clippings by day and stayed up until 3 in the morning mixing my own formulas for hair care products in my cramped kitchen, trying to create something that worked for women who looked like me. Women the rest of the market had decided weren't worth the investment. They were wrong, and proving them wrong built my empire. Today, my cosmetics brand sits on the shelves of every major retailer in the country, and my commercial real estate portfolio spans 3 states. I built this life with my own 2 hands, enduring the sneers of bank managers who didn't want to give a loan to a young black woman in the 80s. I endured, I outsmarted, and I outlasted. I built this fortress so that my family would never have to know the feeling of being small. I built it for my daughter, Maya, and my 4-year-old granddaughter, Chloe. So, when my phone rang on a crisp Tuesday morning and my assistant told me Maya had missed our weekly breakfast catch-up, a cold, unfamiliar knot tightened in my stomach. Maya never missed our breakfasts. More importantly, she never sent my calls straight to voicemail. I didn't wait. I didn't send an email. I grabbed my coat and drove my car straight to the one place Maya always went when the world got too loud. The quiet, secluded park near the lakefront, a few miles from the sprawling estate she shared with her husband, David. The wind whipping off the lake was biting, carrying the sharp chill of early autumn. I pulled my coat tighter around me as I walked down the paved path. The park was mostly empty, save for a few joggers. Then I saw them. My breath caught in my throat. Underneath a large, fading oak tree, sitting on a cold iron bench, was my daughter. Maya was wrapped in a thin trench coat, her posture entirely collapsed. Beside her, kicking her small pink boots against the bench legs, was Chloe. But it wasn't the sight of them at the park that made my heart stop. It was the 3 large, heavy suitcases sitting in the dirt next to them. They were scuffed, hastily packed, with a piece of a sweater caught in the zipper of the largest one. "Maya," I breathed, my voice barely carrying over the wind. She looked up. Her eyes were bloodshot, swollen from hours of crying. Her beautiful face, usually so vibrant and full of life, was completely drained of color. She looked like a ghost of the strong woman I had raised. Chloe, sensing her mother's distress, had buried her small face into Maya's side, her little hands gripping Maya's coat like a lifeline. "Mama," Maya choked out, the word breaking halfway. I closed the distance between us in 3 strides. I didn't ask questions immediately. I didn't demand explanations. I simply reached out and pulled my daughter and my granddaughter into my arms. I let her cry into my shoulder, feeling the violent tremors shaking her body. "I've got you," I whispered, pressing my cheek against her hair. "Grandma is here, Chloe. Everything is all right." I held them until Maya's breathing slowed, until the raw edges of her panic began to dull. Only then did I pull back slightly, looking her squarely in the eyes. "Now," I said, my voice low, calm, and steady. "Tell me exactly what happened." Maya swallowed hard, looking away. Shame was written all over her face, a shame that did not belong to her. I was fired, Mama, this morning, from the company." The words didn't compute immediately. Maya worked as an executive director at Sterling Holdings, a prestigious investment firm owned by her father-in-law, Arthur Sterling. The Sterlings were old money, Chicago old money, the kind of family that had buildings named after them and believed their bloodline was a form of royalty. When Maya married David, Arthur had insisted she join his firm. He painted it as a welcoming gesture, a way to fold her into the family legacy. I had my reservations, but Maya was brilliant, holding a master's in finance, and she wanted to prove she could thrive in their world. "Fired?" I asked, my brow furrowing. You single-handedly secured the Miller acquisition last quarter. Why would Arthur fire you?" Maya let out a bitter, wet laugh. "He didn't just fire me, Mama. He threw me out. I went into my office this morning and security was waiting for me. They had boxes. They stood over me while I packed my desk. When I demanded to see Arthur, they escorted me to the lobby like a common criminal." My jaw tightened. "And the house? The suitcases?" Fresh tears spilled down Maya's cheeks. "When I got back to the house, Arthur was there. Not David, just Arthur. He had the staff packing my things. He stood in the foyer, Mama, with his hands in his pockets, looking at me like I was dirt on his shoes." She paused, taking a shaky breath, struggling to get the next words out. "He told me that I was a liability. He said that I lacked the pedigree required to represent the Sterling name. He told me that my background was finally catching up with me and that I was embarrassing the family. He told me to take my daughter and leave his property before he called the police for trespassing." A dark, dangerous quiet settled over me. Pedigree, background. I knew exactly what those words meant coming from a man like Arthur Sterling. It was the same polite, thinly veiled racism I had faced 40 years ago, dressed up in a bespoke suit and a country club membership. He couldn't explicitly say he didn't want a black woman running his company's top tier, so he used the language of culture and fit. "Where is your husband, Maya?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously level. "Where is David while his father kicks his wife and child out onto the street?" Maya closed her eyes, a look of profound defeat washing over her. "I don't know. His phone is off. Arthur said David agreed with him. Arthur said David finally realized that our marriage was a mistake, a youthful rebellion that went too far. Arthur told me that David is filing for divorce and demanding full custody of Chloe, because my environment is unstable." I looked down at Chloe, who was looking up at me with big, confused brown eyes. The idea of Arthur Sterling trying to take this child, to raise her in a house devoid of warmth, filled only with pride and prejudice, made my blood run ice cold. "He blocked my credit cards, Mama," Maya whispered, the final piece of her humiliation falling from her lips. "I tried to get a hotel. The cards were declined. All the joint accounts are frozen. I had $50 in cash in my purse. I didn't know where else to go." They had stripped her of her job, her home, her husband, and her financial independence all before noon. It was a calculated, precision strike designed to leave her completely paralyzed. They wanted her broken. They wanted her begging. "Stand up, Maya," I said. She looked at me, startled by the sudden shift in my tone. I said, "Stand up." I reached down and picked up the heaviest suitcase, the weight of it grounding me. "You are Helen Carter's daughter. You do not cower in parks, and you do not beg people who are entirely beneath you. We are going home." The drive back to my estate in the northern suburbs was silent. I watched Maya in the rearview mirror. She had her arms wrapped securely around Chloe's car seat, staring blankly out the window. She was in shock. When we pulled through the wrought iron gates of my property, the sheer size and security of the house seemed to finally allow Maya to exhale. I had my staff bring the bags inside and immediately instructed my head housekeeper, Maria, to draw a warm bath for Chloe and prepare Maya's old suite. I made Maya a cup of chamomile tea, forcing her to sit at my kitchen island and drink it. "You are safe here," I told her, placing a hand over hers. "Chloe is safe. Nobody is taking her anywhere. Do you understand me?" Maya nodded weakly. "What am I going to do, Mama? If David really is filing for full custody, Arthur has the best lawyers in the state. They have judges on speed dial. They will paint me as an unfit mother with no income and no home." "They will try," I corrected her gently. "And they will fail, because they have made a catastrophic miscalculation." "What miscalculation?" "They forgot who your mother is." I sent Maya upstairs to rest with Chloe. Once I heard the heavy oak door of her bedroom click shut, the maternal warmth I had carefully maintained completely evaporated. I walked down the long hallway to my private office. It is a room built for war. Wall-to-wall mahogany bookshelves, a massive marble desk, and 3 large monitors set up behind a secure firewall. I locked the door behind me, sat down in my leather chair, and woke up the screens. If Arthur Sterling thought he could financially ruin my daughter and steal my granddaughter over a matter of pedigree, he was a bigger fool than I thought. But as I sat there in the quiet hum of my office, my instincts, The same instincts that had navigated me through shark-infested corporate waters for decades started to whisper to me, something is wrong. Arthur was a bigot, yes. An elitist, absolutely. But he was also a pragmatist. He loved money more than he loved his own pride. Maya was his top earner. She had brought in millions for Sterling Holdings over the last 3 years. Firing her so abruptly, so violently, and freezing her accounts wasn't just cruel, it was bad business. It was sloppy. And Arthur Sterling was rarely sloppy, unless he was desperate. I opened a secure encrypted browser window. While my public empire was built on beauty products and real estate, my private network was built on information. Over the years, I had cultivated relationships with top-tier forensic accountants, private investigators, and cybersecurity experts. When you acquire commercial real estate, you learn how to dig into the deepest, darkest financial closets of the people you are buying from. I sent a quick encrypted message to Marcus, a brilliant forensic data analyst who owed me a favor for quietly funding his startup 5 years ago. Message: I need a ghost look into Sterling Holdings, specifically the accounts managed by Maya Carter Sterling. Look for recent anomalies. Move fast, move quietly. While I waited for Marcus to work his magic, I started pulling public records. Tax filings, SEC reports, quarterly earnings of Sterling Holdings. On paper, everything looked immaculate. The company was reporting consistent, robust growth. 2 hours later, my secure line rang. Helen? Marcus's voice came through the speaker, sounding uncharacteristically tense. I found the back door into the Sterling server. You need to look at what I'm sending you right now. I'm dropping it into your secure Dropbox. A file icon appeared on my desktop. I clicked it open. Talk to me, Marcus. What am I looking at? You're looking at a sinking ship, Helen, Marcus said, the rapid clicking of his keyboard echoing in the background. Sterling Holdings' public reports are a work of fiction. Arthur has been heavily over-leveraging the firm's assets in offshore high-risk derivatives for the last 18 months. He lost big. We're talking a black hole of nearly $40 million. I leaned in, my eyes scanning the spreadsheets Marcus had intercepted. The numbers were staggering. It was a classic shell game, moving debt from one dummy corporation to another to hide the hemorrhaging. He's bankrupt, I murmured, the realization dawning on me. Old money, my foot. The man is running on fumes and credit. It gets worse, Marcus said, his voice dropping an octave. Look at the authorization codes on the transfers that move the debt into the highest risk portfolios. Look at the digital signatures. I scrolled down to the transaction logs. My blood turned to ice. There, stamped on every single catastrophic transfer, on every illegal movement of funds, was an authorization code. MC774, Maya's executive code. Below the digital authorizations were scanned copies of physical documents, internal memos approving the disastrous trades. At the bottom of each one was a signature, Maya Carter Sterling. These are forged, I stated immediately, my voice hard. My daughter has impeccable financial discipline. She would never authorize these trades. This isn't her handwriting. It's a close copy, but the pressure on the M is all wrong. I know that, and you know that, Marcus replied grimly. But to an SEC investigator, it looks like Maya has been running a massive illegal shadow portfolio. It looks like she single-handedly lost $40 million of the firm's money and tried to cover it up. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with sickening clarity. Arthur Sterling didn't fire Maya because she didn't fit his bloodline. He fired her because he needed a scapegoat. He had destroyed his own company with his greed and arrogance. When he realized the audit was eventually going to catch up with him, he needed someone to take the fall. Someone who wasn't a Sterling by blood. He had spent the last 6 months carefully forging her signature, using her digital credentials, and building a paper trail that painted my daughter as a rogue executive, a criminal mastermind who had embezzled and lost the family fortune, kicking her out, cutting off her access to the accounts, taking her phone. It wasn't just to humiliate her. It was to ensure she couldn't log back into the system and see the frame-up he had built around her. It was to ensure she couldn't hire a defense lawyer before the police arrived. He was going to send my daughter to federal prison to save his own skin. And David? David's silence suddenly made terrifying sense. Was he complicit? Or was Arthur holding this over his head, too? Help me frame your wife, or we all go down. I sat back in my chair, staring at the glowing monitors. The anger inside me shifted. It was no longer the hot, blinding rage of a mother seeing her child cry in a park. It condensed, cooling into something absolute, focused, and lethal. Arthur Sterling thought he was playing a game of chess with a naive young girl. He thought he could use his wealth and his name to crush her into dust and walk away clean. He had no idea that by touching my daughter, he had just invited the devil to his doorstep. I reached forward and closed the files. I picked up my phone, dialing the private number of my lead corporate attorney, a man who charged $1,000 an hour and was worth every single penny. "Richard," I said when he answered. "Helen, it's Tuesday evening. Who are we suing?" "We aren't suing anyone, Richard," I said, my voice as calm and smooth as glass. "I need you to assemble the crisis team. I need forensic accountants, your best defense litigators, and I want everything we have on the Sterling family's private debt pulled immediately. Every mortgage, every loan, every marker." "Sterling? Arthur Sterling? Helen, that's a hornet's nest. They're old Chicago money." "They are bankrupt frauds," I corrected him coldly. "And Arthur just made the fatal mistake of trying to use my daughter as his human shield." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. Richard knew my tone. He knew what it meant. "Understood," Richard said, his voice tightening with professional readiness. "What is our objective?" I looked at the framed photograph on my desk, a picture of Maya and Chloe, smiling and carefree. "Arthur Sterling wants to play a game of ruin," I said softly into the receiver. "So, we are going to ruin him. We are not just going to clear Maya's name. We are going to dismantle his empire brick by brick. We are going to take everything he owns, and we are going to leave him with nothing but the clothes on his back." I hung up the phone. The storm had broken, and I was ready to bring the rain. By the time the sun crested over the gray waters of Lake Michigan the next morning, my estate had been transformed from a quiet sanctuary into a fortress of war. I did not sleep. I spent the night on the phone with Richard, my attorneys, and my crisis management team, mapping out every possible vector of Arthur Sterling's incoming assault. I had my head of security, a former Navy SEAL named Vance, double the perimeter guard. Every camera, every motion sensor, every gate code was updated and encrypted. Nobody came within a mile of my property without my expressed permission. When I finally walked into the kitchen at 7 in the morning, holding my third cup of black coffee, I found Maya sitting at the island. She was wearing one of my oversized cashmere sweaters, her hands wrapped tightly around a mug of tea that had long gone cold. The dark circles under her eyes bruised her beautiful skin. "Did you sleep?" I asked softly, taking the stool next to her. "Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Arthur's. The way he looked at me when he told me to get out. Mama, I gave them 3 years of my life. I missed Chloe's first steps because I was closing a deal in Tokyo for that man." "I know, baby," I said, smoothing a stray braid away from her face. "Loyalty given to the wrong people is just a weapon they use against you." Before she could respond, Maya's phone, which I had connected to a secure burner network to bypass the freeze on her accounts, began to buzz violently across the marble countertop. Notification after notification flooded the screen in a rapid, sickening cascade. Maya reached for it, but I clamped my hand over hers. "Wait." I pulled my own tablet toward me and opened the primary financial news networks. It took less than 3 seconds to see what Arthur had done. He hadn't just fired her. He had dropped the guillotine. Breaking. Executive Director Maya Carter Sterling terminated amidst $40 million deficit investigation. Sterling Holdings cooperating with authorities following massive financial irregularities. Sources claim rogue executive diverted funds to offshore accounts. They didn't use the word embezzlement directly. Arthur's lawyers were too smart for outright libel before charges were filed. But they didn't have to. The implication was painted in giant neon letters. Below the headlines was a meticulously chosen photograph of Maya from a gala 2 years ago. Unsmiling, looking aloof, wearing expensive jewelry. The visual narrative was clear. The greedy outsider who infiltrated a respectable family and robbed them blind. Maya stared at the screen, all the blood draining from her face. She stopped breathing. "Mama," she gasped, clutching her chest as a panic attack threatened to pull her under. "They're saying I stole it. The missing money. He's blaming it on me. I'm going to go to jail. Oh my God, Chloe." "Breathe, Maya. Look at me," I commanded, my voice slicing through her panic like a scalpel. I gripped her shoulders, forcing her to meet my eyes. "Do not let him take your breath. That is exactly what he wants." He wants you terrified, erratic, and defenseless. But the news is a piece of paper, and paper burns, I said fiercely. He is controlling this narrative because it is the only thing he has left to control. He knows the audit is coming. He is trying to create a loud enough distraction so the SEC looks at you instead of him. It's a smokescreen. I stood up, pulling my tablet away. Let him talk. A loud man is a distracted man. While he is busy feeding the press, we are going to break his legs. Just then, Vance stepped into the kitchen. His face was a mask of professional stone, but I saw the tension in his jaw. "Ms. Carter," Vance said, "there is a process server at the front gate, accompanied by 2 police officers." Maya let out a choked sob, burying her face in her hands. "They're here to arrest me." "No," I said, my mind calculating the timeline. "The SEC moves slow. Local police don't arrest for federal financial crimes without a warrant that takes weeks to build. This is something else." I looked at Vance. "Let the server through the gate. Keep the police outside the perimeter. Escort the server to the front door, take the envelope, and escort him right back out. He does not step foot inside my house." 10 minutes later, Vance returned with a thick manila envelope. I tore it open. It wasn't a criminal indictment. It was family court. An emergency ex parte custody order, filed by Arthur Sterling on behalf of his son, David. I read the legal jargon, my blood simmering to a slow, rolling boil. Arthur was petitioning the court for immediate, temporary sole custody of Chloe. The grounds? He claimed Maya was a flight risk under federal investigation for grand larceny. Furthermore, he claimed that my home, the estate I had built with 40 years of blood, sweat, and immaculate tax returns, was a den of illicit activity and financial subterfuge, rendering it an unsafe environment for a minor child. It was a dog whistle, loud and clear. It didn't matter that I was a self-made billionaire with a pristine record. To Arthur Sterling, I was just a black woman from the South Side, and in his twisted narrative, my home was inherently suspect. "What is it?" Maya asked, her voice trembling as she watched my face harden. "It's a custody filing," I sadly said, folding the papers sharply. "Arthur is trying to take Chloe." Maya shattered. A guttural, agonized cry ripped from her throat, the sound of a mother whose soul was being torn in two. She collapsed over the kitchen island, weeping with a force that shook the room. I didn't try to stop her tears this time. Let her feel it. Let the pain forge itself into armor, because she was going to need it. Instead, I walked out of the kitchen and back into my office. I locked the door. Arthur had played his opening gambit. He had attacked her reputation, her freedom, and her child. But in his arrogance, he had left a gaping hole in his strategy. David. Where the hell was David? If a man truly believed his wife was a criminal who needed to be separated from his child, he would be at the gate with the police, demanding his daughter. He would be giving statements to the press. But David was a ghost. His phone was off. His social media was dark. The custody papers were filed by Arthur on behalf of David, signed by Arthur through an aggressive power of attorney clause. Something wasn't right. David was weak, yes. He was a man who had lived his entire life in the suffocating shadow of an overbearing patriarch. But he adored Maya, and he worshipped the ground Chloe walked on. A man doesn't just evaporate while his father destroys his family, not unless he is being kept in the dark, or he is a hostage. I opened my secure line to Marcus. "Helen, I saw the news," Marcus said immediately. "Arthur didn't waste any time." "He's panicking," I said. "Marcus, I don't care about Arthur right now. I need you to find his son. Find David Sterling. Track his credit cards, his car GPS, ping his cell phone towers. I don't care if Arthur has him locked in a vault. Find him." "Give me 2 hours," Marcus promised. It took him 45 minutes. "He's not at the Sterling estate," Marcus reported. "And he's not at any of their corporate offices." I pinged a secondary burner phone registered under an LLC tied to David. "It's moving. He's currently at a private executive lounge at O'Hare International Airport. He's booked on a one-way flight to Geneva that leaves in 3 hours. First class, paid for in cash. Geneva, non-extradition for certain corporate crimes. Arthur was sending his son away so David couldn't interfere or testify when the House of Cards collapsed." "Vance," I said, pressing the intercom button on my desk. "Get the SUV. We are going to the airport. And tell your team we are going to be making a non-consensual extraction." The executive lounge at O'Hare was quiet, smelling of expensive leather and stale espresso. Vance and two of my largest security personnel flanked me as we bypassed the protestations of the lounge attendant. I didn't need to look hard to find him. David was sitting in a dark corner booth, nursing a glass of scotch. He looked terrible. He was unshaven, wearing a wrinkled suit that looked like it had been slept in, and his hands were shaking so badly the amber liquid sloshed against the glass. When he saw me approaching, his eyes widened in sheer terror. He tried to stand up, but Vance placed a heavy, immovable hand on his shoulder, forcing him back down into the booth. I slid into the leather seat across from him. I didn't say a word. I just looked at him. "Helen," David stammered, his voice cracking. I can't talk to you. I shouldn't be here. He's going to find out." "Arthur is busy giving statements to Bloomberg," I said smoothly. "He isn't thinking about you, David. He never thinks about you. That's your tragedy." David squeezed his eyes shut, a tear leaking out and tracking through the stubble on his cheek. "You don't understand what he's done. You don't understand what he's capable of. I understand that my daughter is sitting in my kitchen, terrified that she is going to federal prison," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "I understand that a process server just tried to hand me papers to rip a 4-year-old girl from her mother's arms. So before I let my security team drag you out of this airport and throw you in the trunk of my car, I suggest you start explaining why you are running away to Switzerland while your wife takes a bullet for your father." David broke. He didn't just cry, he crumbled. The heavy facade of the Sterling Air collapsed, revealing the terrified, broken boy underneath. "I tried to stop it," David sobbed, burying his face in his hands. "Helen, I swear to God I tried." "Start from the beginning," I demanded. 3 months ago, David said, his words spilling out in a desperate rush. "I found out. I found the shadow ledger." Arthur had been using the firm's capital to short tech stocks through a dummy corporation in the Caymans. He was convinced he could beat the market. He lost $40 million. The firm was completely insolvent. We were ruined. "And instead of going to the authorities, you confronted him," I deduced. David nodded miserably. "I went to his office. I told him we had to report it, take the penalty, file for bankruptcy. I told him Maya was the compliance officer for those accounts, and if the SEC found out, she would go down with the ship." "What did he say?" David looked up, his eyes hollow and haunted. He laughed. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a file. He had been planning it for months, Helen. He showed me the wire transfers. He showed me the authorizations. All of them had Maya's digital signature. He had forged her handwriting on physical memos. He had funneled small kickbacks into a secret account set up under her maiden name. My stomach turned. It was a masterpiece of framing. "He told me," David continued, his voice barely a whisper, "that if I breathed a word of it to Maya, if I tried to go to the police, he would release the file to the FBI immediately. He said with her background and the evidence he manufactured, no jury would believe her. He said he would make sure she got 20 years in a federal penitentiary. He blackmailed his own son." The sheer sociopathy of it was staggering, even to me. He said Maya was collateral damage, a necessary sacrifice to protect the Sterling legacy, David choked out. "He told me my only job was to stay quiet, file for divorce to distance myself and let him handle it. He said if I tried to warn her, he would destroy her before she could even pack her bags. He locked me out of the house yesterday. He took my phone. He handed me a plane ticket to Geneva and told me if I didn't get on it, he would put Maya in handcuffs today." David looked at me, a desperate pleading in his eyes. "I didn't abandon her, Helen. I was trying to save her. I thought if I just did what he said, he would let her go quietly. I didn't know he was going to leak it to the press. I didn't know he was going to try and take Chloe." I sat back in the booth, absorbing the magnitude of the twisted web Arthur had woven. David wasn't a monster. He was a victim of a generational cycle of abuse and narcissism. Arthur had gaslit and terrorized this man his entire life, culminating in holding the freedom of the woman he loved hostage. David's silence wasn't born of malice. It was born of absolute, paralyzing fear. Twist. The game board just shifted. Arthur thought David was his pawn, neatly removed from the board and shipped off to Europe. He thought he had isolated Maya completely. He didn't realize he had just handed me the weapon I needed to destroy him. "David," I said, my tone shifting. The anger was gone. replaced by the cold, calculating precision of a CEO closing a hostile takeover. "Do you love my daughter?" "More than my own life," he said without hesitation. "Good, because sitting in Geneva crying into a glass of scotch isn't going to save her," I said, leaning across the table until I was inches from his face. "Your father thinks he holds all the cards because he has a fake ledger, but you saw the real one. You know where the bodies are buried." "He keeps the original flash drive in a biometric safe in his private study at the estate," David whispered. "But it doesn't matter. You can't get in there. And even if you did, if he suspects I talked to you, he'll drop the forged files to the feds tomorrow." "Let me worry about Arthur," I said, standing up and smoothing out my coat. I looked down at him. "You have a choice to make, David. You can get on that plane, be the coward your father raised you to be, and watch your wife go to prison from a chalet in the Alps. Or you can stand up, walk out of this airport with me, and help me burn your father's empire to the ground." David stared at me. He looked at the boarding pass in his trembling hand. He thought of Maya. He thought of Chloe. Slowly, the trembling stopped. He placed the glass of scotch on the table. He ripped the first-class boarding pass in half, letting the pieces fall to the floor. He stood up. "Tell me what you need me to do," David said. I smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. "We are going back to my house," I said. "And then we are going to plan a hostile takeover. The hardest battles are not won with artillery. They are won with timing. By the time I had David securely sequestered in the east wing of my estate, entirely cut off from the outside world, it was 2 a.m. I had my crisis team working in shifts in the dining room, the mahogany table covered in printed ledgers, proxy agreements, and corporate bylaws. David had given us the key. Arthur wasn't just planning to feed Maya to the federal wolves. He was planning to use the crisis to secure an emergency cash injection from his board of directors to cover his margin calls. "The quarterly board meeting is tomorrow morning at 10, David had told me, his hands wrapped tightly around a mug of coffee. "He's going to present the forged ledger to the board. He's going to claim Maya went rogue, frame the $40 million deficit as an unforeseen embezzlement, and ask the board to authorize a liquidation of their secondary assets to stabilize the firm. Once they vote, the money moves, the deficit is patched, and Maya is officially handed to the SEC on a silver platter." "Then we don't let them vote," I had replied. I didn't sleep that night. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office, watching the city lights of Chicago blink against the darkness. To stop Arthur, I had to walk directly into the lion's den. I needed a reason to be in that boardroom, a legal standing that his security couldn't bypass. That was where Diane came in. Diane was my chief operating officer, but titles didn't do justice to what she was to me. Diane had been by my side for 25 years. We had met when I was still mixing formulas in my kitchen. She was a brilliant, hungry business graduate who couldn't get her foot in the door of the white-dominated corporate world. I brought her in, mentored her, and together, we built Carter Enterprises. She knew where every dime was kept. She knew my mind almost as well as I did. At 6 a.m., I called her. I told her to pull the trigger on the Omaha option. For the last 5 years, through a series of blind trusts and proxy LLCs, Carter Enterprises had been quietly buying up preferred voting class shares of Sterling Holdings. It was a diversification strategy Diane had actually suggested. We owned 14% of the firm, not enough to control it, but more than enough to demand a seat at the table under their corporate bylaws. "The proxies are unsealed and consolidated, Helen," Diane told me over the phone, her voice crisp and efficient as always. "I have the injunction papers drafted. If Arthur tries to call a vote on asset liquidation, we have the legal right to halt it pending a full external audit by a firm of our choosing. Meet me in the lobby of the Sterling building at 9:45, I instructed. Bring the hard copies. At 9:30 a.m., I stepped out of my town car onto LaSalle Street. I was dressed in a bespoke charcoal gray suit, my hair perfectly coiffed, my posture rigid. I did not wear jewelry. Armor doesn't need to sparkle. Diane was waiting in the marble-clad lobby, holding a sleek leather briefcase. She looked immaculate, though her eyes avoided mine for a fraction of a second, a micro-expression I dismissed as pre-battle nerves. "Are we ready?" I asked. "Everything is in the briefcase," Diane nodded, falling into step beside me. We took the private executive elevator to the penthouse level. The doors opened to a reception area that reeked of generations of unearned privilege. Dark oak paneling, oil paintings of stern-faced white men, and the hushed, sterile quiet of money that doesn't like to be disturbed. Arthur's executive assistant stood up abruptly as we approached the heavy double doors of the boardroom. "Miss Carter, you cannot be up here. The board is in a closed session. I am a shareholder exercising my Article 4 right to attend an emergency meeting," I said, not breaking my stride. Vance, who had shadowed us up the elevator, gently but firmly moved the assistant aside. I pushed the double doors open. The boardroom was massive. 12 older men and 2 women sat around a long table. At the head of the table stood Arthur Sterling, a laser pointer in his hand, a projector illuminating a slide titled Q3 Deficit Mitigation and Compliance Breach. When the doors clicked shut behind me, the room fell into a dead silence. Arthur froze. The smug, patrician confidence on his face slipped for a split second before he rearranged his features into a mask of polite outrage. "Helen," Arthur said, his voice dripping with condescension, "I understand you are emotional given the unfortunate revelations regarding your daughter this morning, but this is a closed board meeting of Sterling Holdings. Security will escort you out." I didn't move. I slowly walked toward the table, Diane flanking me. "I am not here as a mother, Arthur, though if I were, I would have brought a baseball bat, not a briefcase," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the cavernous room. I looked around at the board members, making eye contact with each of them. "I am here as the controlling proxy for the Vanguard Hayes Trust, which currently holds 14.2% of Sterling Holdings voting shares. By law, I have the floor." A murmur of shock rippled through the board members. Arthur's face reddened. He looked at his corporate counsel, who frantically typed on a tablet, then turned pale and nodded. "Whatever shares you manage to scrounge up, Helen, they do not give you the right to disrupt." "I am not disrupting. I am intervening," I cut him off, placing my hands flat on the mahogany table. "You are currently asking this board to liquidate prime real estate assets to cover a $40 million margin call deficit. A deficit you are attempting to pin on my daughter, Maya Carter Sterling." "It is a matter of record," Arthur sneered, regaining his footing. "Your daughter circumvented our compliance protocols. She embezzled funds and lost them in unsanctioned offshore trades. We have the digital authorizations and the physical signatures. It's tragic, Helen, truly. But she is a criminal." I smiled. It was a cold, terrifying thing. "You always were a sloppy man, Arthur. You think because you put on a bespoke suit, people won't notice the dirt under your fingernails," I said. I turned to the board. "Gentlemen, ladies, Arthur Sterling has been over-leveraging this firm's capital in Cayman Island derivatives for 18 months. When the market corrected, he lost $40 million of your money." "Slander," Arthur barked, slamming his hand on the table. "This is the desperate delusion of a mother trying to save a guilty daughter." "Is it?" I challenged. "I have a forensic analysis of the server logs proving the executive digital codes were accessed from Arthur's private IP address, not Maya's. I have metallurgical analysis proving the ink on the physical memos was applied months after the dates printed on them." The board members began whispering frantically to each other. Doubt, the most corrosive acid in any corporate structure, was eating through the room. "And most importantly," I continued, my voice rising just enough to command absolute authority, "I have a sworn, notarized affidavit from the man who discovered the shadow ledger. A man who witnessed Arthur Sterling forge those documents and was subsequently blackmailed into silence and forced onto a plane to Geneva." Arthur's eyes widened. For the first time, genuine panic flared in his pupils. "Your son, David, didn't make his flight, Arthur," I said softly, delivering the killing blow. "He's with my attorneys, and he is singing like a canary." The boardroom erupted. Several members stood up, demanding answers from Arthur. The corporate counsel looked like he was about to faint. Arthur gripped the edges of the podium, his knuckles turning white, his breathing shallow. He was cornered. The trap had snapped shut. I turned to my right. "Diane, hand copies of the injunction and David's affidavit to the board secretary. I am officially moving for an immediate suspension of Arthur Sterling as CEO, pending an FBI investigation." I held my hand out, waiting for the heavy weight of the leather folder, but nothing touched my palm. I looked to my right. Diane was standing there, the briefcase clutched to her chest. She wasn't looking at the board secretary. She was looking at the floor. "Diane," I said, a slight edge of confusion bleeding into my tone. "The folders." Diane slowly raised her head. The woman I had shared meals with, the woman who had watched my daughter grow up, looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. It wasn't fear, it was a cold, hard calculation. She didn't hand the folder to me. She walked around me, the click of her heels echoing like gunshots in the sudden quiet of the room, and handed the briefcase to Arthur Sterling. The air left my lungs. The world tilted on its axis. "What are you doing?" The words slipped from my lips, barely a whisper. Arthur Sterling didn't look panicked anymore. He opened the briefcase, pulled out a stack of documents, and a slow, reptilian smile spread across his face. "I believe your chief operating officer has a slightly different assessment of the situation, Helen," Arthur purred. Diane turned to face me, stepping up to stand beside Arthur. "I'm sorry, Helen, but this is business. You let your emotions cloud your judgment. You put Carter Enterprises at risk for a personal vendetta." "Diane," I stared at her, my mind struggling to process the visual evidence of a 25-year betrayal. "He is trying to send my daughter to federal prison. He is securing his legacy, just as you taught me to secure ours," Diane replied, her voice eerily calm. "6 months ago, you authorized me to negotiate the joint distribution venture between Carter Cosmetics and Sterling's retail subsidiary. You signed the final contract without having Richard review it line by line because you trusted me." A sickening dread coiled in my stomach. The distribution venture. It was supposed to be a standard synergy deal. "I embedded a cross-collateralization clause," Diane stated, her eyes locking onto mine without blinking. "A change of control poison pill. It stipulates that if Carter Enterprises initiates any hostile financial action against Sterling Holdings or attempts a proxy takeover, Sterling Holdings immediately gains the right to freeze the voting shares of Carter's executive board to protect the joint venture's assets." "You sold me out," I whispered. The betrayal didn't just sting. It felt like a knife twisting directly in my heart. "For what? Money?" "For the CEO position of the newly merged Sterling Carter conglomerate," Arthur answered for her, straightening his tie. "Diane is a brilliant woman, Helen, but you kept her in your shadow for 2 decades. She built your empire, and you treated her like an assistant. I recognized her true value." Arthur looked down at the documents. "By storming in here and declaring a hostile proxy move, you just triggered the poison pill, Helen. Your voting rights within your own company and your proxy rights here are officially suspended. You have no voice in this room. You have no power." The board members, sensing the shift in the wind, sat back down, their faces closing off. They didn't care about the truth. They cared about survival. Arthur had just neutralized the threat. "The board will disregard Ms. Carter's theatrical interruptions," Arthur announced loudly. "The evidence she claims to have is fabricated. Her own COO has just testified to her erratic, vindictive behavior. We will proceed with the liquidation vote." I stood alone at the center of the room. The men at the table looked at me not with fear, but with pity. That was worse. Diane looked away, unable to hold my gaze any longer. I had been outmaneuvered. I had focused all my attention on the enemy in front of me, completely forgetting to watch the friend standing behind me. "Security!" Arthur called out, picking up his desk phone. "Please escort Ms. Carter from the building. If she resists, call the police." I could have screamed. I could have thrown the projector against the wall, but I remembered what I told Maya. Volume is not power. I slowly buttoned my suit jacket. I looked at Diane one last time. I wanted her to see that I wasn't broken. "A parasite can kill a host, Diane," I said softly, "but it can never learn to build its own home. You just tied yourself to a sinking ship." I turned my gaze to Arthur. He was practically vibrating with victory. "You won the room today, Arthur," I said, my voice eerily calm, resonating with a dark promise. "Enjoy the applause, because when I come back, I am not going to ask for a vote. I am going to take the entire building." I turned on my heel and walked out of the boardroom, my head held high, my posture unbroken. Vance fell into step behind me. The elevator ride down to the lobby was the longest of my life. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a cold, hollow ache in my chest. Diane, the woman I had called my sister, she had handed Maya to the wolves for a corner office. When I stepped out of the Sterling building and into the bitter Chicago wind, my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was Richard, my attorney. "Helen," Richard said, his voice tense. The SEC just publicly announced they are opening a formal probe into Maya based on a whistleblower tip from Sterling Holdings. And the family court judge, Arthur's lawyers pushed it through an emergency hearing while you were in that boardroom. I stopped walking. The city noise seemed to fade into a dull roar. What did the judge do, Richard? They granted the emergency ex parte order, Richard said quietly. Arthur has temporary custody. The police are en route to your estate right now to collect Chloe. I closed my eyes. The trap hadn't just snapped shut. It had crushed us. Helen? Richard asked. What do we do? I opened my eyes, staring at the imposing glass monolith of the Sterling building towering above me. They had taken my company. They had taken my best friend. And now they were coming for my blood. Tell David to get ready, I said, the absolute chill of 0-point clarity settling over me. The corporate war is over. The street war begins now. I didn't tell Vance to break the speed limit on the drive back to the estate. I didn't have to. The tires of the heavy SUV screamed against the asphalt as we tore through the city, my mind operating with the icy mechanical precision that only a mother pushed to the absolute edge can achieve. When we crested the hill leading to my property, the flashing red and blue lights of 3 police cruisers painted the manicured lawns in a harsh, violent strobe. Pull the car across the gates. Block them in, I ordered Vance. Before the vehicle had even fully stopped, I was out the door. The scene on my front portico was a nightmare rendered in high definition. 2 police officers stood on the marble steps. Maya was backed against the heavy oak front door, her arms wrapped around a sobbing Chloe like a human shield. Maya's eyes were wild, feral, the look of a cornered animal prepared to tear out the throat of anyone who took another step toward her child. Ma'am, you need to step aside, the lead officer was saying, his hand resting uncomfortably close to his utility belt. We have a court order signed by a family court judge. We are taking the child into protective custody to be remanded to her grandfather. You will have to kill me, Maya hissed, her voice vibrating with a terrifying primal intensity. You will have to shoot me dead on this porch. Officer, I said, my voice cutting through the crisp air like a whip crack. The cops turned as I marched up the steps, Richard right on my heels, clutching a fresh stack of legal briefs. I stepped directly between the officers and my daughter, effectively walling her off. I am Helen Carter, the owner of this property. You are trespassing. We have a lawful ex parte order, Ms. Carter, the officer said, holding up a piece of paper, though his posture stiffened. He recognized me. Everyone in Chicago knew who I was. I don't want to make this ugly, but we will use force if necessary to extract the minor. You aren't extracting anyone today. Richard stepped forward, handing a counterfiling to the officer. Under Illinois Family Code Section 604, we have filed an emergency medical injunction. Dr. Aris, the child's primary pediatrician, has certified that forcibly removing this 4-year-old from her mother amidst a traumatic event will cause severe, irreparable psychological harm. A judge has 72 hours to review the medical injunction before the extraction can be executed. The officer frowned, looking at the seal on Richard's paperwork. This is a stall tactic. This is the law, I corrected him, stepping so close to the officer he had to tilt his head back to maintain eye contact. I am not resisting your order. I am legally delaying it. You may leave a cruiser at the bottom of my driveway to ensure we don't flee, but if you cross my threshold tonight and lay a hand on my granddaughter, I will bury you and this precinct in so much litigation your grandchildren will be paying off the settlements. The officers exchanged an uncertain look. They were beat cops, not corporate lawyers, and they wanted no part of a headline-making billionaire standoff. Reluctantly, the lead officer backed down. 72 hours, Ms. Carter, he warned. Then we come back with a tactical unit if we have to. Good night, officers, I said, not moving an inch until their cruisers backed down the driveway. Once the taillights disappeared, Maya's knees gave out. I caught her before she hit the marble, holding her tight as we carried her and a terrified Chloe inside. We got the child back to sleep, though Maya refused to leave the chair beside the bed, her hand clutching Chloe's small fingers. I walked down to the dining room war room. The atmosphere was completely different than it had been hours ago. My crisis team looked defeated. They had watched the news. They knew Diane had triggered the poison pill. She locked us out, Helen, Richard said, rubbing his temples. Diane froze your voting shares and corporate liquidity. Carter Enterprises can't deploy capital to fight Sterling. And with the SEC probe opening against Maya, no bank is going to touch us for a personal loan to mount a defense. Arthur won the front yard battle. He did, I agreed, walking to the head of the table. I poured myself a glass of water. Arthur thinks like an old white man who inherited a castle. He thinks because he locked the front gate, the war is over. I took a sip, the cold water sharpening my senses. He forgot that I built my castle from the mud up, and I know every back door, every side alley, and every sewer grate in this financial system, I said, setting the glass down. Diane froze Carter Enterprises' corporate assets. She didn't freeze mine. My sovereign wealth, my private real estate trusts, my offshore reserves. Diane never had the authorization codes for those. I have $300 million in liquid cash that Arthur doesn't know exists. Richard looked up, a spark of hope returning to his exhausted eyes. What's the play? Arthur just convinced his board to liquidate secondary assets to cover his $40 million margin call. But liquidating real estate takes 30 to 60 days to clear escrow, I explained, leaning over the table. He owes that $40 million to private equity lenders, vultures, and vultures don't like waiting. Distressed debt acquisition, Richard whispered, realizing the magnitude of the strategy. Exactly. I want you to contact every single shadow lender, hedge fund, and private bank that holds Arthur Sterling's debt. Offer them a premium. I will buy Arthur's debt in cash tonight at a 10% markup. They get out clean, and they don't have to wait for his board to sell buildings. Helen, if you buy his debt, you become his primary creditor, Richard said, his breath hitching. By sunrise, Arthur Sterling won't owe Wall Street $40 million. He will owe it to me, I said, a grim, terrifying smile touching my lips. And when the 72 hours are up, I am going to call in the loan. I will bankrupt him before he finishes his morning coffee. The team sprang into action, the room exploding into a flurry of phone calls and encrypted wire transfers. As the war machine roared back to life, I stepped out into the hallway to catch my breath. The shadows of the house were deep. From the top of the sweeping staircase, a figure emerged. David. He walked down the stairs slowly. He looked hollowed out, carrying the weight of a man who was finally seeing the world without the blinders his father had bolted to his face. He stopped at the bottom step, looking into the dining room where my team was systematically dismantling his family's legacy. Maya won't even look at me, David said quietly. Can you blame her? I asked, crossing my arms. No. He shook his head. I stood in the doorway and watched her sing Chloe to sleep. I watched her promise that little girl that monsters aren't real, all while knowing my father is the biggest monster of all. David looked up, his eyes meeting mine. They were no longer the eyes of a terrified boy. They were the eyes of a man who had finally found his spine. I grew up in a house with 100 rooms, Helen, and not an ounce of love in a single one of them. I thought that was just how power looked. Cold, ruthless. He gestured around my home. Then I met Maya. I met you. You are more powerful than he will ever be, but you use your power to build a wall around the people you love. He uses his to put them in cages. Insight is a beautiful thing, David, I said gently, but it doesn't solve our immediate problem. Buying his debt gives you financial leverage, Helen, David said, his voice dropping to a serious, urgent register. It ruins him financially, but it doesn't keep Maya out of federal prison. The SEC isn't going to drop the embezzlement probe just because Arthur goes bankrupt. They still have the digital footprint and the forged physical memos. They still think she did it. I know, I admitted, the bitter truth souring my tongue. The debt acquisition is my vengeance, but I am still looking for Maya's salvation. David took a deep breath. My father is a narcissist, Helen. He's arrogant, but he's also deeply paranoid. He doesn't trust digital servers completely. He knows that anything coded can be hacked. He believes the only absolute truth is ink on paper. I narrowed my eyes. What are you saying? When he framed Maya, he didn't just fabricate digital logs. He created physical evidence. He had a custom-made, leather-bound ledger. The Red Book, David explained, stepping closer. It details the actual offshore trades, the real routing numbers, and more importantly, it contains the original memos he drafted before he traced Maya's signature onto them. He kept the originals as a trophy, proof of his own genius. My heart pounded against my ribs. Where is it? In his private study at the Sterling estate. He keeps it in a subterranean wall safe behind the mahogany bookshelf. David swallowed hard. It's a state-of-the-art biometric lock, titanium casing. You can't drill it. You can't hack it. It only opens to his fingerprint. The flicker of hope extinguished as quickly as it had ignited. Then it's useless, unless you plan on cutting off your father's hand. No, David said softly. Arthur is paranoid. He always plans for the worst-case scenario. A stroke, a heart attack, an assassination. He needed a contingency plan so that if he died, the estate could still access his private leverage. David held up his right hand, staring at his own index finger. I am the contingency, David said. My prints are registered in the master system. Silence hung in the hallway, heavy and loaded with implication. David was offering to cross the point of no return. Arthur is hosting a victory dinner tonight at the estate, David continued, his voice hardening with resolve. He's entertaining the board members and Diane, celebrating the stabilization of the company and his incoming control of Carter Enterprises. The security will be focused on the perimeter, keeping the press out. The study will be empty. If you are caught inside that house, David, I warned him, stepping close, he will not show you mercy. He will have you arrested for burglary. He will ruin you alongside Maya. David looked up the stairs toward the room where his wife and daughter were sleeping. He already ruined me, David said. I'm just trying to salvage what's left. The extraction was a ghost operation. Vance drove David in an unmarked matte black sedan, parking 2 miles from the Sterling estate in a densely wooded suburban tract. David knew the blind spots in his father's security grid. He had grown up sneaking out through them. I stayed in the war room, my tablet displaying a secure GPS tracker Vance had slipped into David's pocket. The blue dot moved slowly on the digital map, creeping closer and closer to the sprawling footprint of the Sterling mansion. He's breached the tree line. Vance's voice crackled softly over the encrypted earpiece I wore. He's at the side servant's entrance. The old keypad code still works. He's inside. My lungs tightened. Every second stretched into an agonizing eternity. I pictured the opulent, suffocating halls of Arthur's home. I pictured David, moving like a phantom through the house that had been his prison. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Vance, what's his status? I whispered. He's stationary in the West Wing. That's where the study is, Vance replied. Hold on. I'm picking up audio interference. There's movement in the hallway outside the study. In the study, David stood before the mahogany bookshelf. He had found the hidden latch. The shelf swung open silently, revealing the cold metallic face of the biometric safe. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. From the floor above, he could hear the muffled sounds of laughter, the clinking of crystal glasses. Diane's voice drifting down through the ventilation shaft, discussing quarterly projections with the board. They were dividing up my empire while they drank Arthur's wine. David pressed his trembling index finger against the glowing green glass of the scanner. Scanning. The machine whirred. A red light flashed. Error. Positioning. Sweat beaded on David's forehead. He wiped his hand on his trousers, steadying his breathing. Focus. Do it for Maya. Do it for Chloe. He pressed his finger down again, firm and flat. The machine hummed. Beep. The light turned solid green. The heavy titanium bolts retracted with a heavy, satisfying clunk. David pulled the heavy door open. Inside, sitting on a velvet shelf, was a thick crimson leather ledger. Beside it was a manila folder. He opened the folder. Inside were the original trade authorizations, signed in Arthur's sprawling, aggressive handwriting. The blueprint of the frame-up. David grabbed the book and the folder, stuffing them into his jacket. He pushed the safe door shut, waiting for the bolts to lock, and swung the bookshelf back into place. He turned to leave. The brass doorknob of the study began to turn. David froze, his blood turning to ice. Someone was coming in. He threw himself behind the heavy velvet drapes just as the heavy oak door swung open. The lights flicked on. Through a tiny slit in the fabric, David saw his father. Arthur Sterling walked into the room, holding a glass of scotch, a triumphant smirk plastered on his face. Diane walked in right behind him. "A brilliant play today, Arthur," Diane said smoothly. "Helen didn't see it coming." "Helen is a relic," Arthur scoffed, walking over to his desk to pour Diane a drink. "She built a nice little cosmetics company, but she doesn't have the stomach for real corporate warfare. By tomorrow morning, the judge will finalize my custody of the child, and Maya will be sitting in a federal holding cell. The Carter name will be completely toxic. We absorb their distribution lines for pennies." Behind the curtain, David felt a wave of pure, unfiltered hatred wash over him. Not fear, hatred. This was the man who had raised him, a man who viewed human lives as mere line items on a balance sheet. "To the new era," Diane said, clinking her glass against Arthur's. They drank, entirely unaware that the instrument of their destruction was standing 3 feet away, holding the matches that would burn their world to ash. Arthur's phone buzzed. He checked it, frowning. "My security chief." "Excuse me, Diane, I need to take this in the hall." Arthur stepped out. Diane lingered for a moment, admiring the art on the wall, before turning and following him out, leaving the door slightly ajar. David didn't hesitate. He burst from behind the curtains, slipped through the door, and bolted down the servants' corridor, disappearing into the night before Arthur's security chief could even report the perimeter breach. 40 minutes later, the matte black sedan pulled back through my gates. I was standing on the front porch, waiting. David stepped out of the car. He looked exhausted, his suit disheveled, but his eyes were blazing with a fire I had never seen in him before. He walked up the steps and pulled the heavy crimson ledger and the manila folder from his jacket. He placed them directly into my hands. "It's all there, Helen," David said, his voice raw but steady. "The real accounts, the original signatures, proof of the forgery." I opened the folder, my eyes scanning the documents. The undeniable truth, written in Arthur's own hand. The smoking gun. A fierce, dangerous smile broke across my face. I looked at David, seeing him not as the weak boy who had let my daughter down, but as the man who had just risked his freedom to save her. "You did well, David," I said softly. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was Richard. "Helen," Richard's voice was vibrating with excitement. "The wire transfers just cleared. The offshore banks accepted the premium. The contracts are signed. It's done." "Confirm it, Richard," I said, my grip tightening on the red ledger. "Carter Sovereign Wealth now officially owns 100% of Arthur Sterling's $40 million distressed debt," Richard confirmed. I looked up at the night sky. The 72-hour clock was ticking, but I no longer needed the time. I had the sword, and I had the shield. "Draft the foreclosure notice, Richard," I commanded. "And call the FBI director in the Chicago field office. Tell him to have his federal agents meet me at the courthouse tomorrow morning. We are going to serve Arthur Sterling a very special kind of justice." The air inside the Cook County Courthouse always smelled of cheap floor wax, stale coffee, and desperation. It was an arena where lives were dismantled on paper, where families were broken by the strike of a wooden gavel. I had never lost a battle in a courtroom. I did not intend to start today. I walked down the long marble corridor with Maya holding my left arm and Richard flanking my right. Maya was pale, her fingers trembling slightly against my sleeve, but she held her head high. She wore a tailored ivory suit, a deliberate contrast to the dark, sinister narrative Arthur had painted for the press. She looked like a CEO, not a criminal. Behind us walked David. He was quiet, carrying a nondescript leather briefcase. No one in the press pool outside had recognized him beneath his dark coat and sunglasses. To the world, the Sterling heir was supposedly in Geneva. We pushed through the heavy wooden double doors of courtroom 302. Arthur Sterling was already seated at the petitioner's table. He looked immaculate, exuding the smug, untouchable aura of a man who believed the universe was custom-built for his convenience. Sitting directly behind him in the gallery, wearing a string of victory pearls, was Diane. When Arthur saw Maya, a smirk touched the corner of his lips. When he saw me, his eyes darkened with a victorious sneer. He thought I was showing up to beg. He thought the 72-hour medical injunction was just my way of delaying the inevitable. He didn't notice David slip into the back row of the gallery, obscured by the shadows of the heavy oak paneling. "All rise," the bailiff called out as Judge Eleanor Vance took the bench. She was a no-nonsense magistrate with a reputation for ripping through corporate and family obfuscation with equal prejudice. Because Arthur had tied his custody petition directly to the allegations of massive corporate fraud, the hearing had been consolidated into a high-stakes emergency review. "Be seated," Judge Vance said, adjusting her glasses as she looked over the towering stack of files on her desk. "We are here to review the emergency ex parte custody order regarding the minor child, Chloe Sterling, and the petitioner's request to formally freeze the respondent's personal assets pending federal investigation. Mr. Sterling's counsel, you have the floor." Arthur's lawyer, a slick man with a voice like oiled gravel, stood up. "Thank you, Your Honor." The facts here are tragic but indisputable. The respondent, Maya Carter Sterling, has engaged in massive corporate embezzlement, resulting in a $40 million deficit for Sterling Holdings. We have submitted digital logs and signed authorizations proving she orchestrated these illegal trades. Because she is facing imminent federal indictment, she is an extreme flight risk. Furthermore, the Carter estate has become a hostile environment. We ask that the ex parte order be permanently enforced, granting my client, the child's grandfather, full legal and physical custody, and that all of Ms. Carter Sterling's assets be frozen immediately. The lawyer sat down, looking immensely pleased with himself. Arthur adjusted his cuffs, his gaze fixed on Maya like a predator watching a wounded bird. Judge Vance turned her piercing gaze to our table. Carter Sterling, or counsel? Do you have a defense against these allegations? Richard stood up, smoothing the front of his jacket. He didn't look at the judge. He looked directly at Arthur. Your Honor, we do not have a defense, Richard said clearly. A collective gasp rippled through the small gallery. Maya flinched, but I placed a steadying hand over hers. Across the aisle, Arthur's smirk widened into a full, triumphant grin. Diane leaned forward, practically tasting her new CEO title. We do not have a defense, Richard continued, his voice echoing in the dead silent room, because you cannot defend against a fiction. Maya Carter Sterling did not steal $40 million. She couldn't have. Sterling Holdings didn't lose that money to embezzlement. They lost it because Arthur Sterling is a catastrophic failure of an executive who gambled his firm's leverage on high-yield offshore junk derivatives. Objection! Arthur's lawyer shot up, his face turning red. Slander. Your Honor, this is a desperate smear tactic. Overruled, Judge Vance snapped. Sit down, counselor. Mr. Hayes, you better have something substantial to back up that claim, or I will hold you in contempt. Richard nodded, picking up a single sheet of paper. I do, Your Honor, but more importantly, the financial standing of Sterling Holdings is highly relevant to this custody hearing. Arthur Sterling claims he is the stable, financially secure option for this child. I am here to inform the court that as of 8 a.m. this morning, Arthur Sterling is personally and corporately insolvent. Arthur let out a loud, barking laugh. Insolvent? Sterling Holdings has over $1 billion in managed assets. This is absurd. Managed assets that you do not own, Arthur. I spoke for the first time. I stood up slowly, commanding the gravity of the room. I didn't look at the judge. I looked dead into the eyes of the man who had tried to destroy my blood. Your Honor, I said, my voice dangerously calm. Arthur Sterling attempted a hostile proxy maneuver against my company yesterday, utilizing a change of control clause to freeze my corporate assets. He assumed that by tying the hands of Carter Enterprises, I would be unable to defend my daughter. I stepped out from behind the table. But he forgot that I do not just run a corporation. I am a sovereign entity. Last night, utilizing my private offshore wealth trusts, I reached out to the private equity firms holding the $40 million margin debt that Arthur Sterling created. Arthur's smile vanished. The color began to drain from his face, dropping rapidly from his cheeks to his collar. Behind him, Diane sat up straight, her eyes widening in sudden, dawning horror. I bought the debt, Arthur, I said, the words falling like anvil strikes in the quiet courtroom. All of it. At a 10% premium. I own the markers on your offshore derivatives. I own the collateralized mortgages on the Sterling building. I own the deed to your estate. You can't do that, Arthur stammered, gripping the edge of his table. The polished veneer of the aristocrat was cracking, revealing the terrified old man underneath. The board authorized a liquidation to cover those margins. The board authorized a 30-day liquidation, I corrected him, stepping closer to the aisle. But as the new primary shadow creditor of your distressed debt, I am not bound by your board's timeline. The clauses in your shadow loans, the ones you signed in secret to hide your losses from the SEC, stipulate that the creditor can call the loan due in full immediately upon a material change in management or a public scandal. I looked at the judge. Your Honor, I am officially calling the debt. Arthur Sterling owes me $44 million, payable right now. And since I know he does not have the liquidity to pay it, I have already filed the foreclosure paperwork. This is illegal, Arthur shouted, losing all composure. He pointed a shaking finger at me. She's trying to bankrupt me to save her thief of a daughter. Maya stole the money. We have the digital logs. We have the signatures. "No, Arthur," a new voice rang out from the back of the courtroom. "You have forgeries." Every head in the room snapped toward the gallery. David Sterling stood up. He pulled off his sunglasses and walked out of the shadows, moving down the center aisle. He looked at his father, his expression a mixture of profound sorrow and hardened steel. "David?" Arthur breathed, stepping back as if he had seen a ghost. "What are you doing here? You're supposed to be in Geneva." "I missed my flight, Dad," David said. He walked past his father without stopping, approaching the low wooden gate that separated the gallery from the bench. He opened his leather briefcase and pulled out the heavy crimson leather ledger and the thick manila folder. He placed them gently on the defense table in front of Richard, then turned to address the judge. "Your Honor," David said, raising his right hand. "My name is David Sterling. I am Arthur Sterling's son and Maya's husband. I am willing to testify under oath right now." "Proceed, Mr. Sterling," Judge Vance said, leaning forward, utterly captivated by the implosion of the Sterling dynasty happening in her courtroom. David looked back at his father. 3 months ago, I discovered that my father had lost $40 million in unsanctioned trades. When I confronted him, he threatened to frame my wife for the embezzlement unless I remained silent and filed for divorce. He told me he had manufactured digital footprints to match Maya's executive codes, and that he had traced her signature onto backdated internal memos. "He's lying," Arthur screamed, spit flying from his lips. "My son has had a nervous breakdown. He's being manipulated by that woman." "Silence, Mr. Sterling, or the bailiff will gag you," Judge Vance roared, her gavel slamming down like a gunshot. She looked at David. "Do you have proof of these extraordinary claims, young man?" "I do, Your Honor," David said. He pointed to the red ledger on our table. "That is my father's private, handwritten ledger. It details the actual trades, the real routing numbers, and the dates he executed them, months before he claimed Maya did. And inside that manila folder are the original blank memos with my father's true signatures on them, before he traced my wife's name over them to create the physical evidence he gave to the police." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. The weight of the evidence was crushing. It was the undeniable physical manifestation of Arthur's malice. "Where did you obtain these documents, Mr. Sterling?" the judge asked. "I broke into my father's biometric safe in his private study last night and stole them," David admitted, his voice steady. He looked at Maya, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I committed burglary. I will accept whatever penalty the law requires, but I could not let an innocent woman, the mother of my child, go to prison for my father's crimes." Maya pressed her hand to her mouth, a choked sob escaping her lips. It was a sob of relief, of disbelief, of a heavy, suffocating chain finally snapping. Arthur collapsed into his chair. He looked like a puppet with its strings suddenly cut. He stared at the red ledger on our table, his mouth opening and closing silently. His invincible empire had been burned to the ground by the son he thought was too weak to strike a match. I turned my head slightly, locking eyes with Diane in the gallery. She was clutching her purse to her chest, her face the color of wet ash. She had betrayed her mentor, sold her soul for a corner office in a company that, as of 5 minutes ago, I completely owned and intended to liquidate. She had tied herself to a sinking ship, and the water was rushing in. "Your Honor," Richard said, breaking the silence. "Given the evidence presented, evidence that directly proves the petitioner engaged in extortion, blackmail, wire fraud, and forgery, we move that the ex parte custody order be dissolved immediately with extreme prejudice." Judge Vance didn't even hesitate. "The emergency ex parte order is hereby dissolved," the judge declared, her voice ringing with finality. "Full physical and legal custody remains securely with the mother, Maya Carter Sterling. Furthermore, based on the testimony and evidence brought before this court today, I am issuing a bench warrant." Before Arthur's lawyer could even formulate an objection, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. 4 men in dark suits walked in, their badges clipped to their belts. The FBI. I had Richard call the Chicago field office director at dawn, presenting them with scans of the Red Book. They had been waiting in the hallway for the judge's cue. "Arthur Sterling," the lead agent said, bypassing the low gate and stepping directly up to the petitioner's table. He pulled a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and extortion. Stand up and put your hands behind your back." Arthur didn't fight. He didn't yell. The arrogance had been completely bled out of him. He stood up slowly, an old, broken man, and offered his wrist to the agent. The click of the handcuffs echoing in the silent courtroom was the most beautiful symphony I had ever heard. As they led Arthur down the aisle, he stopped briefly beside my table. He looked at me, his eyes hollow. "You destroyed my family," he whispered. I looked back at him, my expression utterly devoid of pity. "No, Arthur," I replied softly, my voice carrying the weight of 40 years of survival. "You destroyed yours. I just protected mine." 1 year later, the autumn wind off Lake Michigan was brisk, scattering gold and crimson leaves across the sweeping back lawn of my estate. I sat in a plush wicker chair on the veranda, a warm cup of herbal tea resting in my hands, a cashmere blanket draped over my lap. I watched the scene unfolding near the edge of the gardens. Maya was laughing, a bright, unburdened sound that carried on the breeze. She looked radiant. 6 months ago, she had officially taken over as the CEO of Carter Enterprises. She had purged the board of anyone loyal to Diane, who was currently facing her own civil liabilities and was entirely unemployable in the corporate world, and had steered the company to its most profitable quarter in a decade. Running across the grass, squealing with absolute delight, was 5-year-old Chloe. She was chasing a golden retriever puppy we had adopted for her birthday, and running right behind her, pretending to be a slow, lumbering monster, was David. David didn't live at the estate with Maya. Rebuilding trust takes time, and healing from the trauma Arthur inflicted on their marriage wasn't a process that could be rushed. But David had spent the last year in intensive therapy, unpacking the decades of abuse he had suffered. He had pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor charge for the burglary of the safe, paying a fine and serving probation. He was a different man now. He was present. He was gentle. He was fighting every single day to earn his way back into Maya's heart, not through grand gestures, but through quiet, consistent devotion. Maya hadn't filed the divorce papers. She was letting him try. That, to me, was a victory. Sterling Holdings no longer existed. I had foreclosed on the debt, liquidated the remaining viable assets, and donated the Sterling estate to a nonprofit organization that provided housing and legal defense for battered women and children. It felt like poetic justice to turn Arthur's fortress of pride into a sanctuary for the vulnerable. Arthur himself was currently serving a 15-year sentence in a federal penitentiary. I took a sip of my tea, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. People often mistake volume for power. They think power is the ability to shout the loudest, to crush the opposition, to amass more wealth than you could ever spend in 10 lifetimes. But as I sat there, watching my daughter smile and my granddaughter laugh in the safety of the empire I had built, I knew the truth. True power is not the ability to destroy. True power is the absolute, unyielding capacity to protect the things you love. And if the world ever forgot that, I was always ready to remind them.